So again, welcome everyone to today's webinar. If we haven't met before, my name is Layla and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. Thank you for coming to today's webinar entitled How Government Works in Canada. We are pleased to welcome our presenter, Ryan Clark. Ryan has done a number of webinars with us in the past on issues related to advocacy. As president and founder of Advocacy Solutions, he helps advocates synthesize advocacy campaigns, amplify campaign messaging, and engage and influence key decision makers through the development and implementation of impactful advocacy strategies. Since founding the practice in 2003, Ryan has spoken about advocacy across Canada and internationally, teaching and training thousands of people on how to make their voices heard. In today's webinar, he will provide an overview of the different levels of government and discuss how advocates can engage with decision makers during and outside of the election season. At the end of the presentation, Ryan will answer your questions. However, at any time during the webinar, please feel free to type your questions into the question box in your control panel. For those of you who have not attended an earlier webinar, the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network is an organization working with cancer patients and survivors to learn about health system complexities, connect with others to plan action, and act to promote best care and healthier survivorship. If you would like to learn more about CCSN, please visit our website at survivornet.ca. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available tomorrow on YouTube. In addition, the slides will be available on SlideShare. Links to both will be sent to the email you provided. I will now turn things over to Ryan. Welcome.
Thanks, Layla, and welcome everybody. So here is our agenda for today. We'll go through a review of the governments in Canada, structure of the federal and provincial governments and politics. We're going to talk a bit about petitions and a little bit about elections as well. And then, as Layla said, we'll have a Q&A. So I'm really excited to do this webinar. We've never done a webinar on this topic before. And so in addition to the outcomes which Layla went through, I just wanted to let you know the rationale for why we decided to do this particular webinar is because if you're going to advocate to government in the context of healthcare issues or anything else, you really need to have at least a basic understanding of what government is in Canada, how it works, and how it's divided. Excuse me. So we have a lot of slides to get through. And so why don't we just jump right into it? Okay, so we're going to start really at the kind of the top level here. And as I trust most of you know, Canada is a federal state parliamentary democracy and constitutional monarchy. Those are three separate things, and we are all of those things. As it says there, a federal state brings together a number of different political communities with both a central government as well as local governments. We're going to talk about this in more detail. As a parliamentary democracy, we elect people to our parliament and our legislatures, as you're all aware. And then finally, as a constitutional monarchy, we have a head of state who is sovereign and who reigns in accordance with our constitution. Three levels of government in Canada. We have federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal. Each one has its own arrangement of both elected and appointed officials, as well as a unique set of responsibilities. First, a really important point I want to make here that you may or may not be aware of is that all municipal and local governments in this country are a creation of the provinces. So there is no constitutional protected for the right and existence of the city of Toronto or the region of Halton or anything like that. They are creations of the province. If the province wanted to eliminate, any province wanted to eliminate any regional or local government, they have the complete constitutional right to do that. So this is an important thing to remember. Only the federal government and the provincial governments, and by extension the territorial governments, are enshrined and protected in the Constitution. So our elected officials at the federal level are called MPs, members of parliament. I'm sure a lot of this is basic knowledge for you, but we're going to go through it anyway. At the provincial level in Ontario, elected officials are called MPPs, members of provincial parliament. Now, Ontario is the only province or territory that uses the designation MPP. Different provinces use different designations. So here they are, quite just quickly. Quebec calls their provincial representatives MNAs, members of the National Assembly. Newfoundland and Labrador calls their provincial representatives MHAs, members of the House of Assembly. And then all of the remaining provinces and the 3 territories all call their provincial and territorial representatives members of the National Assembly. I don't know why all these differences, but that is the difference in this country. Our Constitution. So there are 3 main parts to the written component of our Constitution. There's the Constitution Act of 1982, which describes the authority, parts, and functions of Parliament. Next is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This describes all of our basic rights and freedoms that we have in this country. And then there's something called the amending formula. This is how we change our Constitution if we want to change it as Canadians. So those are really the key pieces. Obviously, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about any of this stuff, but that's kind of our framework. That's the foundation upon which we operate. And when the Fathers of Confederation in this country chose a federal form of government, that was a specific choice that they made. They assigned particular responsibilities to the provinces and particular responsibilities to the federal government. And that's what I want to touch on now. So those responsibilities are outlined in sections 91, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the Constitution Act of 1867, originally now called the Constitution Act of 1982 after the repatriation back in the early 1980s. This division of powers is based on the idea of subsidiarity, meaning that the government level closest to the issue governs it. So in other words, to use a really silly example, you wouldn't have the federal government responsible for picking up your garbage. It doesn't make sense relative to the proximity of the federal government to the need of, for example, picking up garbage and that kind of thing. So here's an overview of the powers that fall within the federal government's purview. This is pretty much all of them. There's some other ones that I haven't included here, but this is just a snapshot. Note that the highlighted reference to the only thing linked to healthcare under Ottawa's jurisdiction, the only specified power that the federal government has in healthcare is the one that you see there. Now, they have another power that's linked to healthcare, a very important one, which has to do with money and who pays for our publicly funded healthcare, obviously. But just note that that's the only explicit power that they have. So if any of your advocacy issues fall within one of those powers listed above, you need to target or advocate to the federal government. They're the ones who have the power. Note as well that residual powers are powers that are not contained in the Constitution, all by law revert to the federal government. In the United States, it's the opposite. Any power that's not iterated goes to the state governments. In Canada, it goes to the federal government. That's by legal extension. It doesn't explicitly say that, but that is the way it works in this country. Section 92 are all the provincial powers. So you'll notice that the power that the provinces have in this country to deliver health care is established as a result of that highlighted text you see. Now, the term healthcare didn't exist in 1867, so you're not going to find the term healthcare anywhere in the Constitution. But instead, you have what you see there: the establishment, maintenance, and management of hospitals, asylums, charities, what are called eleemosynary institutions, which really just is an institution that's founded by a charity. In and for the province, other than marine hospitals, which you saw was a responsibility for the federal government. So that is the section 92. I don't have the subsections there, but this is why the delivery of healthcare is and will always be the sole responsibility of the provinces. So again, if any of your issues fall within one of those powers listed on the screen. Your advocacy target must be to the provincial governments and by extension to the local governments. So if you notice the last bullet on the left-hand side, municipal institutions in the province, that's the power given to the provinces under the Constitution that allows them to create things like the City of Toronto Act, which is an act of the Parliament of Ontario, the Legislature of Ontario, to create the City of Toronto. One final thing: there are concurrent powers. Agriculture and immigration are concurrent powers that are shared by both the federal and provincial governments. So let's turn now to how the federal government works. So sitting atop the three branches of the federal government and the provincial governments as well is the monarchy, which includes the Queen's representative, the Governor General in the case of the federal government. Then we have the legislative branch, which creates statutes under federal jurisdiction, made up of the members of Parliament who sit in the House of Commons and the Senate. Then we have the executive branch, which is responsible for government operations, functioning the government, and implementing and enforcing laws. That includes the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, whose members who are appointed by the Prime Minister. And then we have the judicial branch as well. So just a note that I will not be talking in any detail about the judicial branch in this presentation, as engagement with that branch of government is a completely different undertaking, as you can all appreciate. And of course, I trust that all of you understand that we don't advocate to the monarchy. And so that leaves your advocacy targets within the government as the legislative branch and the executive branch. So those are the two branches that we're going to be focusing on as we go through this presentation, both at the federal level and at the provincial level. Our electoral system in Canada, which is obviously tied to our government as well. So our electoral system operates under two principles: federal electoral system, single member constituencies, which means that one representative, we have a single representative for each riding or constituency or district, whatever term you want to use in Canada, and that we have a first past the post election, which simply means, as I'm sure most of you know, is that during an election, that candidate who gets the most votes wins. They don't have to get more than 50% of the vote. They only have to get more than any of the other candidates who they're running against, and that's the person who wins. Again, this is our electoral system, but other electoral systems in democracies work differently, but this is ours. The party system within the House of Commons. So a political party, by definition, is a group of people that share common beliefs, ideas, and plans of how to govern. And while there have been a number of political parties in Ottawa over the years since Confederation, the current ones represented in the House of Commons are the Liberal Party of Canada as a minority government, the Conservative Party of Canada as the official opposition, and then these other three parties in a minority government, of which any one of them could hold to some extent the balance of power. Now, the one thing that I said we would do right up front is I would highlight as we go through this presentation where you can advocate as we go through this structure. And this is the first sort of point at which I want to make mention of this. Now, you could advocate to a political party between elections, but that's not generally done, except in the context of a lead up to an election. So for example, to get an issue of importance to your organization included in a party's platform leading up to an election. We do that. That is a very common thing that's done in the context of advocacy in this country. What is of course more typical, or most typical of course, is advocating to individual or local MPs. You're all aware of that. So this is the first point at which I want to obviously point out the importance of being able to do that work and taking the time to do that work. And just a reminder, and again, I'm sure most of you know this, but traditionally the Conservatives and the Bloc have been right of center political parties in our system at the federal level on the political spectrum, and the other three parties have been left of center. Again, that's at the federal level as it relates to these five particular parties, but different parties, different times populate different places or hold different places on the political spectrum, but that's where we're at now. So here's a quick snapshot of the House of Commons. This is the most up to date. There are 338 members. This is the breakdown. You can see again, it's a minority government. It's a relatively, what we call a relatively strong minority government, which allows them to govern in many ways like a majority, but technically, of course, it's not a majority government. And you can see all the different representatives of the parties and from the from the provinces and territories. Let's turn now to the Senate and their party or affiliation system. The Senate used to be made up of Liberal and Conservative members, meaning senators who were appointed by one of the two parties that have formed a government in Canadian history. You may recall again, only the Liberals and the Conservatives, or some version of the Conservatives, have ever formed a government ever in this country. That is all different now, as you can see from this slide, and as you'll see on the next one. So there are actually 5 parties, but they're not all parties, so that's why I use the term affiliations within the Senate right now. There's something called the Independent Senators Group. The Conservative Party of Canada still has its senators, Canadian Senators Group, Progressive Senate Group, and non-affiliated. To break it down really simply, 2 of these parties or affiliations are or were Liberals, 2 of these parties or affiliations are or were Conservatives, and 1 of them is just completely not affiliated with any of the parties whatsoever, any of the 2 parties whatsoever. Again, here's a breakdown of the appointed Senate. We have a number of vacancies right now. In fact, over 10% of the Senate is vacant right now. But this is how the parties or the affiliations currently break down. Okay, let's turn now to the legislative branch at the federal level, which is essentially the House of Commons. Most statutes originate in cabinet. They're called government bills, and are passed by the House of Commons after multiple rounds of debate and decision making, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second. In a majority parliament, cabinet has the ultimate control over the output of the legislative branch. So in a majority government, what cabinet wants, cabinet gets through the legislative branch. But in a minority parliament, like we have now in Ottawa, cabinet only has general control over the output of the legislative branch. They don't have absolute control over the legislative branch. So just a reminder, in a minority parliament, advocating to the opposition parties is very different than in a majority situation. In a minority parliament or a minority situation like we have now, the minority parties can actually influence the government's agenda. Really important point to remember, certainly given the current state in Ottawa. So I'm not going to go through this in a whole lot of detail. It's kind of here for your reference, but people often wonder, well, how are laws made? How does this all occur at the federal level? And this is basically a very simplified snapshot of it in terms of how a bill becomes a law, essentially, or statute. So you've got first reading, then you've got second reading, after which time the bill could go to committee stage. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Then you've got third reading, and then off it goes to the Senate. The only point I want to make here is that the Senate has a parallel first, second, third committee reading structure that it goes through. Then it gets royal assent, which simply means it's signed by the Governor General, kind of thing. So statutes or acts set out the general framework and often contain the provisions for regulations. I'm going to come back and talk about that in a moment, just to kind of clear up some of these terms that are thrown around, often interchangeably, which means incorrectly because they mean different things. And just a reminder that bills can originate in the Senate. A bill can actually come from the upper chamber in Canada at the federal level. So committees of the House of Commons examine in small groups selected matters in greater depth than is possible in the House of Commons. They report conclusions of those examinations and recommendations to the House of Commons. Committees undertake studies on departmental spending, legislation, and issues related to their mandate. Now, your MP may sit on one or more of these committees unless they're cabinet ministers. Cabinet ministers don't sit on parliamentary committees. There's an entirely separate cabinet committee structure, which I'm not going to talk about at all today. And committees, both committees in the House of Commons and in the Senate, will often invite public input into their work. So that's a very important advocacy mechanism to keep in mind. Many of you may be familiar with the committee here called HESA, the Health Committee. And you may also be familiar that they will often call for public input into their deliberations. That is a very key advocacy opportunity for anybody who's working in healthcare. Here is the comparable committee structure in the Senate. Again, you'll note that it covers off many of the same areas that we have in terms of the committee structure in Parliament. So again, advocating to the Senate committee or having an opportunity to appear or provide information to a Senate committee is another form of advocacy. So let's now turn to the executive branch at the federal level. When we talk about the government in everyday language, we're usually talking about the executive branch, even though earlier I mentioned that the government technically refers to all three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. And in fact, it actually refers to the Crown as well. So that's why you'll hear the media say, for example, the Trudeau government, referencing technically the executive branch currently headed by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So the executive branch sits within the legislative branch. That is the most apt way to describe our system. It's also called the government, as I said, and consists technically of cabinet, which is a committee within the Privy Council. I'm not going to explain the Privy Council as part of this. That's a whole other, again, area to get into. And non-political civil service staff within each department or agency. The head of government in our country is the Prime Minister, appointed by the Governor General. Again, the head of state is the monarchy as represented by the Governor General. Again, in Canada, we have a head of government and a head of state. The United States, the president is the same, is the head of state and the head of government. The Prime Minister selects the cabinet, who are also appointed by the Governor General. And the Prime Minister and cabinet stay in power as long as they maintain the confidence of the House of Commons. So although the executive branch sits within the legislative branch, and in a majority government can control the legislative branch, it exists because of the legislative branch, and in a minority parliament can fall as a result of a determination by the legislative branch. Okay, I hope that's all clear moving forward. Now, continuing on with our discussion of the executive branch, on this slide, the people on the left, we refer to them as the political side. They are made up of people that have been elected and chosen to serve in the executive branch, along with their staffers. I was a staffer at the provincial level because there's a parallel structure at the provincial level, which I'll talk about when we get to the provinces. The people on the left come and go with every election and are responsible for setting out the broad direction that the government of the day chooses to pursue. The people on the right are referred to as the bureaucratic side, or their civil service. They are made up of people who have chosen a career working in government at various levels, often across several portfolios over the course of their working lives. The Prime Minister cannot fire these people, for example. The Prime Minister can't decide, oh, I want to fire this bureaucrat kind of thing. There's an exception to that. All deputy ministers serve at the pleasure of the Crown, meaning they can be appointed and can be fired by the Prime Minister, but not anybody really under that level. The people on the right are more permanent. They remain in place regardless of who gets elected. and are responsible for implementing the overarching direction set down by the government of the day, as well as just running the day-to-day operation of the federal government. And of course, on par with advocating to individual local MPs for you, advocating to cabinet ministers and civil servants is one of the cornerstones of engaging governments in this country. Now, let me just turn briefly to laws now as we close out the federal piece, because again, this is part of the executive branch. Laws consist of three primary components: statutes or acts, those are essentially interchangeable words, that are passed by the legislature or the House of Commons; regulations, which are passed by cabinet; and this third bucket that we typically call policies, but that can refer to other things like directives, standards, and guidelines. These are developed by the bureaucracy, by those civil servants you saw a moment ago, and used to implement, in practical terms, statutes and regulations. So I'm going to give you an example. It's actually a provincial example, but it is in healthcare, just to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about here. So the Ontario Health Protection and Promotion Act is a statute or an act that is in effect right now in the province of Ontario. Again, it's called the Health Protection and Promotion Act. That statute has 19 current regulations. One of those regulations that were passed by cabinet, is entitled School Health Programs and Services. In that regulation, so this is like a funnel, we're going down, 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 down. In that regulation, it says the following. This is a quote: "Every Board of Health shall provide oral health promotion to elementary school pupils." That's what it says in the regulation. And in turn, each Board of Health would determine through their own policies, directives, standards, guidelines, it doesn't matter, those four words, we're just going to use them interchangeably. They would determine through their own policies how best to fulfill that requirement in their individual communities. So in Ontario, in the city of Toronto, each Board of Health, the Board of Health in Toronto, would decide how they want to fulfill the directive that says every Board of Health shall provide oral health promotion to elementary school pupils. It may be very different than how it's done somewhere in Niagara or Ottawa or Windsor or wherever else. That's fine. They're still fulfilling the requirements of the regulation, which is standard. That doesn't change. That applies to the whole province. But implementation, when you go down to the policy, directives, standards, guidelines level, that can differ depending on the region, certainly as a result of this particular example. So these words matter because a policy is not the same as a statute, and a regulation is not the same as a guideline, and a regulation is not the same as a law. They're different. Well, technically it is part of the law. Forget the word law for a second. A regulation is not a statute. They're different. These are all different things, and language is important here, especially when you're advocating. Are you trying to change a regulation? If you're advocating to change a regulation, then you need to get cabinet to pass it. That's a lot easier than trying to get a statute amended, for example, where it has to be passed by a legislature. And getting a policy amended in your particular region is a whole lot easier than trying to get a regulation amended for the whole province or the whole country, for example. See what I mean? Okay. The next group of slides illustrates the parallel content we've just reviewed at the provincial level using Ontario as an example. Now, not every province operates in exactly the same way as I'm about to review. Most notably, some of the smaller provinces in particular don't operate in exactly the same way, but the differences are minimal. Overall, the differences are minimal. So a lot of these slides are going to mirror the slides we just went through at the federal level, so I'm not going to go through them in the same level of detail. But again, starting with the three branches of government at the provincial level, we have a monarchy sitting on top of the branches with a lieutenant governor in each province. We have a legislative branch that's responsible for the same content as in Ottawa. The executive branch operates the same way, headed up by the premier in each province, and then again, a judicial branch that is responsible for all of the judicial matters that fall within the scope of the province. And again, I'm not going to get into the difference between the federal court system, the provincial court system, and that kind of thing. And aside from advocating to the Senate, all of the advocacy opportunities I highlighted in the federal government section we just went through hold true at the provincial level. Same electoral system, exactly the same. Party system, exactly the same in all of the provinces. As you'll see in a second, yes, next slide. One of the territories is slightly different, but this is the current makeup of the Ontario party system in this province, which I won't go through in any detail. Here's a look at the current parties in power at the provincial and territorial level, along with the date of their next election, including the date of the next federal election, where we have fixed date elections. So from an advocacy opportunity, a couple of things that are important to note here. Number one, the federal, Ottawa, our federal government at the federal level, and all of the provinces have fixed date elections except Nova Scotia. And so when you're thinking about advocating in the context of a lead up to an election and that kind of thing, you know when the next election is going to be. Now, any premier at any time can call an election. These fixed date elections are the target date of the next election unless the provincial legislature falls or a premier, and he or she can do this anytime, can just decide to call an election. Secondly, or second item I want to note here, every province and territory has a majority government except for Newfoundland and Labrador. That's the only minority parliament right now at the provincial level. And two of the territories, Northwest Territories and Nunavut, do not have a party system. It's a non-affiliated political system in those two territories that are represented by gray. Yukon does have a party system, just like the rest of the provinces. Legislative branch in Ontario, again, same content, same that we went through at the federal level. Statutes come out of cabinet. You can have private members legislation as well, which you can also have at the federal level, which I don't think I mentioned, and all the rest of it is the same. Again, there's no Senate at the provincial level, so you don't have that second review process like you do in Ottawa. Slightly different committee structure in Ontario. Each province has its own committee structure. In Ontario, we have what are called standing committees, and these exist for the entire duration of the parliamentary session and tend to be the same in every parliamentary session historically, maybe not exactly the same or exactly the same titles or scope of jurisdiction or review, but generally the same. And then you have what are called select committees in Ontario, which exist for a certain period of time. They come in, they look at something very specific, and then they essentially disband. Again, your MPP, or depending on where you live, MNA, MHA, MLA, may sit on one or more of these committees. Executive branch in Ontario and all the rest of the provinces, essentially largely the same. So I won't go through that in any detail. Again, the split between the political side on the left and the bureaucratic side on the right, again, is pretty much the same as Ottawa. So now let's conclude with just two parts that I want to talk about, petitions in a little bit more detail, and then we'll talk a little bit about advocacy in the context of elections. So both petitions and advocacy in the context of an election are important moments for an organization to be able to engage government in advocacy. And that's why I wanted to go through these in a little bit of detail, just to give you a flavor of them. Petitions to the House of Commons. There are a number of different rules around this, including the fact that all petitions that you want to bring forward to the House of Commons have to be reviewed by the Clerk of Petitions, a nonpartisan employee of the House of Commons, whose responsibility is to certify the requirements of a petition, the requirements of which you'll see in a bit, or I'll go through in general detail. Just a note that petitions started on external or third-party platforms like change.org cannot be introduced and will not be accepted by the Clerk of Petitions. So the purpose of petitions is to draw attention to an issue, as it says there, or to compel the government or the ministry or the members of the House of Commons to take or refrain from some action. That's the purpose of a petition. They can only be submitted by a member of Parliament. As I said, there are requirements that must be met. Two particularly important requirements are it has to fall within federal jurisdiction. Remember back section 91, those things that are responsibility of the federal government. Well, the petition must be one of those things. It can't address an issue that does not fall within the jurisdiction of the federal government. That's logical. It also can't address an issue that is the subject of a legal proceeding or that is currently before the courts. So some do's and don'ts about petitions. And this is a general overview of the requirements that that exist in the context of the Clerk of Petitions. It has to be written in either French or English. It has to be respectful, using temperate language, not contain improper or unparliamentary language. So don't be disrespectful or offensive in the language that you use. And it also can't contain any sort of personal attacks on an individual, Parliament, the courts, or any other what are called duly constituted authorities. Federal petitions can be gathered and delivered both electronically, they're either called online or e-petitions, and in paper form. So at the federal level, to the House of Commons, you can have both electronic petitions and paper petitions. Each format has quite a number of specified steps and requirements that we don't have time to go through today. But if you'd like more information about how to prepare and submit petitions to the House of Commons, just send me an email. We've actually done quite a bit of research in this area in preparation for this presentation, but we just don't have the time to go into it. But we have all of this information. We'd be happy to share it with you. So just send me an email and we'll send along the information that we have. Petitions to the provincial legislatures. Every province or every provincial legislature, excuse me, has their own specified steps and requirements, just like Ottawa. Again, we don't have time to go through each one individually, but here are on the slide some of the most common elements that you will see in provincial petitions. The only province that allows online or e-petitions is Quebec. All of the other provinces are still paper, still just paper, sort of thing. Again, you can see what's on the slide. The slides will be available to you. If you're in a particular province, just like the offer I made a moment ago at the federal level, if you're in a particular province and you want to do a petition to your provincial legislature and you want some more information about it, or you're kind of looking for a jumping off point, we've done the research. Happy to try to steer you in the right direction if that's helpful. Okay, as we draw to the final section, then let's discuss advocacy during elections. With there being a minority government in Ottawa, there's always the risk of a snap federal election. There's a lot of rumors that there may be an election this spring in Canada. And so I thought I'd review 5 of the best ways organizations can engage in the political process during an election, just in case we have one in the coming months. Now, before we begin, just a reminder that during an election, while the executive branch continues to exist and operate, the legislative branch is dissolved. There are no sitting MPs during an election period. And so advocacy at this point is to candidates, not MPs. So when an election is called and the writ is dropped, as the saying goes, you don't advocate to your MPs because they don't exist. You can only advocate to candidates. You can still advocate to a minister or to the executive branch because that does continue to exist, but you can't advocate to a member of parliament. And because these people are not in positions of power, asking them to do anything tangible is not very realistic. So when we do advocacy to candidates, the whole idea of your ask needs to be tangible, as I'm sure many of you have heard me talk about, goes out the window to some extent. Instead, your focus should be on introducing yourself and starting to build a relationship, because sometimes a candidate can lose one election and win the next one. So building a relationship with that person is still worth it. Starting to familiarize them, the candidates, with your issues, and starting to set the stage to return to that person who wins, who will then be in a position to do something for you. Now, having said that, the things I'm going to go through with you here in a moment are tangible things that you can ask parties and candidates to do. It's just that all of these tangible things are a precursor to that person ultimately getting in power and then ultimately being able to make the change that you require. Okay, so we'll do this quickly. Party platforms. Take the time to read the party platforms as they relate to healthcare. You'll notice that the ones here from 2019 that I've put up are all about money, while making promises connected to the delivery of healthcare, because the federal government doesn't deliver healthcare. So party platforms, that's the first one. Next, the pandemic obviously means that all candidates' meetings will occur virtually, but attending all candidates' meetings is still a wonderful way to get your message across. Other than the bullet about the media that we have here on this slide, the rest of the content is still very applicable in the context of advocating during a pandemic. So attending local all candidates meetings, still a very good way to get your issues to come forward to the candidates and ultimately to one of the people who will win. Talking to candidates at the door, I put up this rather old photo of people canvassing during an election because you might think it's an out-of-date practice, but it's actually not. Door-to-door canvassing remains the primary method for local candidates to meet the voters during an election. The problem is most voters aren't prepared to meet their candidates, and of course, if we have a spring election this time, the pandemic, will preclude any in-person canvassing. But that doesn't mean it won't happen virtually. So you'll just need to adapt the points noted on this slide as if it were going to occur virtually, and there will be virtual canvassing or something akin to that if we have an election during the pandemic. Next, drafting and delivering questions to the federal parties, their leaders, and/or local candidates is a very common advocacy activity by organizations during elections. And as you can see from this example, CCSN did exactly that for several issues back in 2019, including one around the National Pharmacare program. Then based on what CCSN shared, they asked the various candidates to answer the following 2 questions. A, your party's position based on what we would like to see in a national pharmacare program, and B, support a new federal equalization payment to the provinces. your organization could do exactly the same type of thing around an issue of importance to you or to your supporters. And again, all of this can be done virtually, which is terrific in the context of where we're at today. And finally, pledges. Pledges are not often used as questions in Canada. They're much more popular in Europe, but they're still an effective advocacy activity that can be used by groups during elections. This is actually an example of one that we used in the last Ontario provincial election. And notice the use of the term actively engage, the theme of the bullets there in the text. The words were purposely chosen so that Family Service Ontario could go back to the people that were elected and sign the pledge to request, we now need you to actively engage as you pledged by taking the following tangible actions. So again, actively engage is not tangible. It's not as tangible as it needs to be in the context of making public policy change, for example. But for an election, it's perfectly fine because again, if the candidate who wins signed your pledge, you then go back to them and you translate the intangible, actively engaged commitment into a tangible way to make the change that you require. And again, pledges are easily adapted to virtual advocacy engagement. And so just in summary, these are the advocacy opportunities that I went through with you as we kind of rolled through all of that content. And so you'll have it there just as a summary and as a reminder of where you as an organization or where your organization and supporters can engage in our overall political, government, electoral processes, both at the federal and provincial and territorial levels. And that's it. Leila?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ryan, for that presentation. So we still have about 10 minutes left for some questions to be asked. So if you have any questions for Ryan, you can type them in the chat box. So we'll start off with the ones that we have right now. So first question, what is the best method for a patient who wishes to advocate for an issue to begin this process to make a change in the healthcare system with regards to cancer treatment, for example?
So everything starts with your locally elected representative. I mean, we're 99 times out of 100, that's where it starts. So it would start with your locally elected representative. So now the question is which one, federal or provincial? Well, the delivery of healthcare is largely the exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces. So you would start with your provincially elected representative. In most cases, I can't think of any cases where you wouldn't. And so then it's a matter of which province do you live in or territory, and then you would contact that person, you would reach out to them. If it's not within the context of an upcoming election or anything like that, or you're not in an election, because again, if you're in an election, you don't have a locally elected representative, then you would just reach out directly to that person, and you could phone them, you could send them an email, whatever it may be, and that's how you would initiate the process. That's why we say the two real big pieces in terms of how you reach out to people and start to engage them is either at the local level that I just described, or if you're an organization, you might go directly to the executive branch or to, again, what is commonly called the government, meaning the Minister of Health, a staffer within the Minister of Health's office, perhaps a bureaucrat within the Ministry of Health, or that kind of thing. But if you're an individual, you always start with your locally elected representative.
Thank you. Next question, why are change.org petitions not are considered?
I don't know. I just know that the federal government, or the House, I should say the House of Commons, and the provincial legislatures all have very strict rules about petitions and how they're worded, how they're accepted, how they're introduced, the responsibility of ministers to respond to them. There's a lot of detail here. And for whatever reason, I suspect it's because they want to control the process. That's my guess. They will not accept any third-party petitions. So I know that a lot of people use change.org as an example. I know that change.org can very quickly get a lot of people to sign up to something. And I know that change.org and the results of those kinds of online petitions can be leveraged as an advocacy tool to make change. No argument about that. But they can't be introduced into the legislature at the provincial level or at the House of Commons at the federal level. That's my main point, is that they cannot supplement or be introduced as part of that particular advocacy exercise.
Next question, are there certain non-party or non-government advocacy organizations that you would say are credible and reliable for petitions to the government?
Non-party or sorry, what was it, Layla? Non-party or?
Non-government.
Non-government. Yeah, I'm not really sure I understand the question. Again, if you want to do a petition as an individual or as an organization, you simply need to do it in the context or in compliance with how it's structured within your province or within your or at the federal level. And it's not difficult to do. It's pretty straightforward in terms of how you can do it, and then do it that way. But there aren't really anything other than doing it that way and in compliance with the way they require it is not something that can be introduced into the legislature. I mean, again, there are ways to use third-party petitions. I'll give you an example. So, and let's take change.org as an example. So if you could somehow get all these people to sign up to change.org, and you could somehow, and I don't know if you could do this or not with the program, and you could somehow print off or put on paper all of the, say, 15,000 people that signed your petition through change.org. Let's say you could do something like that. You could then take that stack of paper, the visual of the stack of paper, to a provincial cabinet minister and say, here, this is a representation, a physical representation on paper of the change that's being demanded by Albertans around this particular issue. It doesn't matter that it was captured on change.org, who cares? That's not the point. You're saying that here is a representation of the change that's being demanded, kind of thing, a physical representation, and deliver that. That kind of stuff we've done in the past, and that can be really, really impactful. What you can't do then is take that stack of papers and have an MLA in Alberta introduce it into the legislature. But the visual of having a stack of papers like that, for example, leveraging it on social media, leveraging it through traditional media, and that kind of thing, can be very impactful and a really, really good advocacy tool that, again, we've used several times in the past, depending on the campaign. So I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure I totally understood it, but I hope that's helpful.
So the next question is just asking for clarification. So they said, if I understood correctly, it is better to contact the deputy ministers that are permanent rather than ministers that come and go.
So that's a good question. The answer is you should be contacting both in terms of your advocacy efforts. It was just to show the distinction between the two sides, and I probably should have been clear about that. You're going to want to build relationships, and you're going to want to advocate to, ideally, particularly if you're an organization, both sides, both the political side and the bureaucratic side, recognizing that the people on the political side are going to come and go, and you're going to be constantly building new relationships with people because they're going to be constantly cycling in and out. Whereas on the bureaucratic side, you're going to have longer term relationships and ones that really stand the test of time because they don't come and go. But no, you should be building relationships with people and advocating to people on both sides.
Next question, what can you do if your MP refuses to represent you in the House of Commons?
So in the context of a petition, there's not much you can do other than we have a little technique that we pioneered many, many years ago because no MP or provincial member is required to introduce a petition into the legislature is when we, and this is pre-pandemic, but there's ways to do it even in the context now. When you drop off your stack of paper petitions, take a picture. Take a picture of you handing the paper petitions to the elected representative, and then ask them, will you introduce this into the legislature for me? If they say no, take them back. Give them to them. Take them to another representative who will introduce them into the legislature. And if they say yes, well then of course you're going to want to tweet about it and post it on Facebook and tell the whole world that of course they're going to introduce the petition into the legislature because they told you they were going to. And then once you tell the whole world, they really don't have any choice but to do it. But we actually encourage people to ask just to make sure that they will do that. Representing you in Parliament outside of petitions through things like member statements or questions, that's kind of a different exercise that, again, just in the interest of time, I don't really, I can't really get into, but that's my answer as it relates to petitions.
Thank you. So we're just about at 2 o'clock, so I think we'll stop there with questions. If you have any other questions for Ryan, you can always send an email to us at info@survivornet.ca, and we can always help get you in contact and get you any follow-up answers that you might require. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Ryan for hosting a very informative presentation on how we can interact with our government and just some more information on how the government works. So this was the first webinar that CCSN has for 2021. We do have more coming up, so stay tuned for more details about the rest of our webinar series. World Cancer Day is coming up on February 4th, so we have some stuff planned for that as well. And we will also be releasing the results of our second survey commissioned by Leger that looks into the impact that COVID-19 has had on cancer patients. So stay tuned for that as well. Thank you again, everyone, so much for attending today, and take care.